Alright guys, welcome back. We're up to topic 8.7 of the APUSH curriculum, so just about halfway through our final big period, topic 8.7. And today we're going to focus on what's known as America as a world power. So we're going to delve back into the Cold War a little bit, talk about nuclear weapons, and some other big topics. We're going to look at also how America began to kind of throw its weight around a little bit in the 1950s and 60s. So let's get into it and decide how America was affected by its role as world power after World War II. Let's begin with nuclear weapons. So if you recall, the Manhattan Project began in 1940, and by 1945 we were ready to use atomic weapons. And most American diplomats and scientists and so forth were convinced that America would have that nuclear monopoly for years, maybe a decade or more, until the Soviets could catch up with their own atomic bomb. So we were rather shocked when this occurs, way ahead of schedule. In September of 1949, the Soviets detonated their very first atomic bomb. And again, this was incredibly shocking to us. And we were, worried. Like, wait, what do we do next in response to this? So the response was, well, if the Soviets can build atomic bombs like we can, let's build even more powerful bombs. And this brings into what's known as hydrogen bombs, which are incredibly powerful, hundreds, upwards of 1,000 times more powerful than your run-of-the-mill atomic bombs like we used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The idea of using a hydrogen bomb, which is fusion as opposed to nuclear fission, had been around for a while. It was very hypothetical, theoretical sort of thing. And it was not something we had pursued just because it didn't seem like it was useful. In fact, there was quite a bit of opposition to this program of building even more powerful bombs than the atomic bombs. J. Robert Oppenheimer, who had been the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, came out against this hydrogen bomb, saying basically it's a weapon of genocide. It was totally unnecessary. It's just too powerful. So by 1952, America is ready to test out its first hydrogen bomb, and we did this in the South Pacific. You can see a picture here of a hydrogen bomb being detonated, again, on a scale that's just hard to even imagine, hundreds of times more powerful than the bomb we used on Hiroshima. Our hydrogen bomb monopoly did not last long, however. The Soviets caught up in 1953, so we're now basically at the same level when it comes to nuclear power in terms of bombs. And just a few images here of these blasts. So if we both have the same type of weapon, now it's okay, what's the next step to gain superiority? And it was decided to build up more of them, and then also, of course, fleets of airplanes to deliver them to targets. So again, we have the same type of bombs, so maybe if we have more of them and better airplanes to deliver them, that will give us the edge. So we go into mass production of atomic and hydrogen bombs. And you can see the type of bomber which would have been used, particularly in kind of the mid to late Cold War. It's called the B-52 Stratofortress. By the 1960s, however, we have progressed in technology. We still have airplanes that can deliver atomic bombs, but of course the airplane has a crew on board that's vulnerable. The crew has to make a round trip, so it can only fly so far before it turns back, before running out of fuel. And a lot of those limitations were basically ended with this new device called an intercontinental ballistic missile. So basically it's a long-range missile that can fly between continents, and they can carry nuclear payload. So this is basically the same type of missiles that we're using in the space race to carry astronauts and cosmonauts and all that, but instead this time around we're going to put nuclear payloads on them and then of course direct them at the enemy. So some of these nuclear missiles will be kept in what's called missile silos, which are basically like tubes in the ground. Missiles can also be stored on submarines, so that submarines can sail around the globe, and you can have these things lurking off the coast of the enemy, and then that missile comes flying out and hits their target. So you might be thinking, okay, how could the proliferation of nuclear weapons actually make the world safer? It seems counterintuitive. And the reason it does is through this process known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. And MAD was this realization that both countries had the ability to wipe out the other side, and neither side would really effectively survive a nuclear war. So I won't start the nuclear war if you don't start the nuclear war. We'll just kind of stay on our own sides. And this actually made the world safer because, again, of the danger of what would happen if the nuclear war actually occurred. There's, again, B-52 bomber. These things could be used to deliver the nuclear payload to the enemy. Now, with this proliferation of nuclear weapons comes a growing sense of nuclear paranoia. The thought is that a nuclear attack could come from the Soviet Union at any time, kind of a nuclear Pearl Harbor type scenario. And to save one's family, you might want to build a fallout shelter. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what exactly does a fallout shelter do? Well, it's not designed to protect you from the actual blast of a nuclear bomb. What it's designed to do is protect you from radioactive fallout. So when the nuclear bomb goes off, it kicks up tremendous amounts of debris and dust into the air, and it can fly tens of thousands of feet up into the atmosphere. And then that nuclear radiated dust can then fall out of the sky somewhere else, wherever the wind is taking it. And that means the area around you could be irradiated for days or weeks. And so to kind of ride that out, what you're going to do is you're going to build a fallout shelter so you'll be protected from the radiation. You'll stay underground until it's safe to come out. And not all Americans, of course, created these, but certainly some did, and it just shows you how we had to cope with the Cold War, that a nuclear war could occur at any time. And to further prepare us for that, cities and schools and sometimes even businesses would periodically conduct air raid drills, kind of like we have fire drills in school. These air raid drills would basically prepare people to react in a certain way if we had a surprise attack. So the siren would go off, and you would know to look for the nearest bomb shelter, to ride out the bomb and the radiation thereafter. And that way, people in theory wouldn't panic. They would be ready and prepared to survive. And of course, ducking and covering was taught to students in school. Probably not very effective, particularly if the nuclear blast is anywhere nearby. But if it's far enough away to where it just breaks, say, the glass windows in a classroom or something, ducking and covering could, in theory, help save from injuries. Now, the Cold War saw, of course, no use of nuclear weapons in anger, but we did see hundreds of nuclear tests going on across the world. And some people become very concerned that, well, okay, if we're blowing nuclear bombs up and we're throwing radiation into the atmosphere, is that going to hurt us? And so they conducted this thing called the baby tooth survey. And what that was is basically people were urged to send in the baby teeth of their children. And these baby teeth were analyzed chemically. And what they found out is there were elevated levels, in fact, much higher than normal levels of strontium-90. And that meant that these kids had been exposed to nuclear radiation. So probably what was happening is that fallout from these nuclear tests was getting into the soil, and then, say a cow would eat the grass that's also now radiated, and then it's passed into the milk, and the kid drinks the milk, and and so forth. And so this was really concerning that we're poisoning the planet, and it led to what's known as the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963. And it said going forward, countries would no longer conduct open-air nuclear tests. Going forward, there were some tests underground, but even that would later be ended. And so we don't test nuclear weapons this way any longer, again, because of the potential damage. All right, let's go south of the United States, south of Florida to Cuba, see what's going on there, and see how it fits into this idea of America as a world power. And for a little bit of context, we're going to learn that America had long supported a dictator from Cuba named Batista. And Batista had been your typical Latin American caudillo, this sort of strongman, military leader, who runs his country very fiercely. The people usually remain poor and powerless while the leadership becomes very wealthy. So that builds up a lot then of resentment towards the leadership. But Batista had been a pro-American leader, so we liked him and we didn't want to see him fall. But he does, in fact, fall from power in 1959 when Fidel Castro, a revolutionary, overthrows Batista. Now, after taking over the government, what Castro and his friends do is they began to nationalize certain industries, which means taking over American-owned property in Cuba. And so American businessmen were furious about this, investors as well, that they were going to be losing out a lot of valuable profits and investments in Cuba. So America was very, very upset about this. And then Castro enters into a military alliance and political alliance with the Soviet Union. And this is a big deal because now we have a communist country, an ally of the Soviet Union, only 90 miles away from Florida. This is extremely concerning. So to retaliate back against the Cubans, in 1961, we imposed a very strict trade embargo on Cuba. And elements of this embargo still remain. Now, it's definitely been a loosening of this embargo since, say, I don't know, the 20-teens or so, but it is definitely still in place in certain elements, at least as of 2021 when making this recording. Now, ultimately, our vision was to rid Cuba of Castro's regime, and that meant possibly taking military action. Now, invading Cuba directly would be incredibly provocative, and it might actually spark a larger war, perhaps even a World War III scenario. So instead of doing that, we decided on having Cubans invade Cuba. Now, if that sounds weird to you, a lot of Cubans had fled during this revolution in the early days of Castro's rule, rather, and they were looking to unseat Castro as well. And so a group of these Cuban exiles were trained by the CIA and given the green light and support to invade Cuba, to overthrow Castro. Now, this is a plan that had been started under Eisenhower's administration. It's a plan that JFK is going to inherit and then ultimately give the green light of his own to carry this process out. So on April 12th, 1961, 1,200 exiles were landed on what's known as the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba. The theory was that the Cuban people would rise up and join with these revolutionaries and overthrow Castro, but that did not actually occur. The Cubans were able to sort of rally and defeat this invasion, and it was incredibly embarrassing to America because we had attempted this and it failed pretty spectacularly. And it gives Cuba and the Soviet Union something to brag about, and also gives them sort of a boldness to try something new and more dangerous in the future, like, say, putting Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. So in October of 1962, U.S. spy planes which are flying over Cuba detect basically some activity. And this activity looks like construction of nuclear missile launching sites that are being, prepared down in Cuba. Now, the missile sites aren't ready, but they will be shortly, and so we have to act quickly. We have to decide what we're going to do about these nuclear sites, because this puts us within range of Soviet nuclear missiles with very little warning time. These missiles could be on us in just minutes, basically, and so this is going to be dangerous to live with for sure and unacceptable. Now, we take our evidence to the UN and show everybody what the Soviets are doing, how provocative this is, and then we have to decide what we're going to do. Now, JFK is getting a lot of military pressure to invade Cuba, to seize the nuclear missile sites by force. JFK decides that's too provocative, so instead he goes to kind of Plan B. Plan B is basically a naval blockade of Cuba. Now, we didn't call it a blockade. We called it a quarantine because blockade's an act of war. But basically, we're going to ring Cuba with American naval ships and not let any more Soviet ships in. Okay, so we're going to basically kind of draw the line around Cuba and say, no, sorry, Soviet Union, you're not allowed to sail in these waters right now. So this effectively puts the whole incident into Nikita Khrushchev's hands, how he's going to react to this. Will he break the blockade? What will he do? And if he does, how do we react at that point? And JFK announces this policy to the United States, to a very wary and worried America. There were Americans who were, pretty sure this was the end of the world, that nuclear war was more or less inevitable at this point. And so this might be the final days everyone will be living. It was a very worrying time for sure. Now, in the end, Nikita Khrushchev backs down. He knows the Soviet Union doesn't want a nuclear war, doesn't want a World War III, and so he agrees to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. All right, now let's look at covert operations, or secret operations. And we're going to look at two countries with this covert activity. The first is Iran. If you're not sure where Iran is, it is in the Middle East, right north of Saudi Arabia, east of Iraq, in that neighborhood. Now, back then, the Soviet Union went all the way down here and also down here. And so the Soviet Union was a northern neighbor of Iran. And this was something we were always very concerned about, that somehow, some way, Iran might go communist. It might be another one of those dominoes. Iran, for its own part, was beginning to kind of flex its independence a little bit, and they began to nationalize Western oil fields, which means American and particularly British investors are going to lose out a lot of money because they're going to lose access to these oil fields, which are now owned by the Iranian government. Now, in response to that and the fear that Iran was beginning to turn towards the Soviet Union as an ally, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, our spy agency, basically works with some Iranians to cook up a coup. And this coup overthrew the elected prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, and basically put him under house arrest. So this is going to generate a lot of resentment in Iran against the United States, because what it looked like, because it really was this way, was America interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. That we were basically saying, we know better than the Iranians, and we're going to change their government for them, whether they like it or not. And you can see that resentment there. Now, this is not the only source of current day tension between us and the Iranians, but it certainly is a major moment on that road. All right, the other country to look at in terms of U.S. involvement and kind of behind the scenes is Guatemala. So Guatemala is in Central America, and it was a country that was very poor, but it was also a country that was great for growing fruit, bananas in particular. And many of these vast plantations were owned by American companies like the United Fruit Company, which basically was almost like a shadow government ruling Guatemala based on what was best for those companies. And a leftist government takes power, a government that was probably going to nationalize many of these plantations, meaning that American businessmen and investors would lose a lot of money. And so in response to that, the CIA finds some people to lead a coup in Guatemala, and that government is overthrown. So much like we did in Iran, we're doing this in Guatemala, where we're basically choosing a government that we feel would be better for our interests and not really looking out for the interests of those particular countries. All right, well, let's now look at some foreign nationalism. So, remember, before World War II, the world was still very much European dominated, and there were plenty of colonies all around the world. And then after World War II, in the 10, 15, 20 years after World War II, you see a lot of countries gaining independence. What had been European colonies now becoming their own, free sovereign nation. One of these countries would be Egypt. And in 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser takes over the country, and he was what's known as a pan-Arab nationalist. He wanted to unify all Arabs under like one united Arab republic, basically. Now, he ran afoul of American interests because what happens is he had started to become friendly with the Soviet Union, and we had been looking to pay the Egyptians, or at least providing them with loans to build the dam on the Nile River. But then when Nasser becomes friendly with the Soviets, we pull that money out, and so tension between us and the Soviets grow, and between us and the Egyptians as well. And then in 1956, Nasser just does something very provocative, at least provocative from the perspective of Europeans, not provocative from the peaceful perspective of Egypt. And what he does, he nationalizes the Suez Canal. Now, as a quick reminder, the Suez Canal was built largely by French engineering in the 1800s. It was owned primarily by British and French stockholders. So in other words, it's a privately owned canal. And Nasser says, well, no, it goes through my country, and so therefore it's Egyptian, not French or British. So he literally just takes it over and says, it's mine now. And by mine, I mean Egyptian. The French and British didn't much care for this idea, knowing they'd be losing out on a lot of money, but also they feared this would set a dangerous precedent. And so in October 1956, Britain and France decide to launch an attack on Egypt to reclaim the Suez Canal. And France and Britain are going to get the help of Israel in this war. Israel, of course, has its own problems in this region with its neighbors, including Egypt. Now, this is not something that America was sort of giving the thumbs up to. We were not approving of this invasion. So when it occurs, it catches us a little by surprise, and we feel as if Britain and France had done something kind of dangerous. And the reason, of course, that it's dangerous is if Egypt is getting friendly with the Soviet Union and Britain and France are attacking Egypt, there's always a danger that the Soviet Union will feel compelled to come in and defend Egypt, and then a war will break out, and then it will spread to America, and we could be looking at World War III over the Suez Canal. And our president at the time, General Eisenhower, says it's just not worth it. So he compels Britain and France to withdraw their forces by withdrawing oil from them. So, like, we're not going to supply you with oil, and so therefore your armies will grind to a halt, so you better pull them out of Egypt now. And they do, and Egypt, in the end, got to keep the Suez Canal. All right, so that's it, guys, for our topic here, America as a world power. And, yeah, we're about halfway through period 8 now, and in our next video, we'll keep chugging along.